Okay, so first, before we begin, just a reminder that Monday is the holiday, Labor Day. So we're not going to have class on Monday, and so the next time we'll meet will be Wednesday. So I guess enjoy your holiday weekend, and then, like I said, we'll pick up on Wednesday. We'll see how far we get today, and we'll on Wednesday we'll talk about the article. Very good article, very interesting, by Blanda, and it's just about how, especially it's relevant, I think, now with the election season, election coming up, everything that's happening with social justice and everything that's happening with COVID and the arguments back and forth with who's responsible or how can we better fix it and so forth. It's a good article that we'll look at talking about how the other side may not always be so wrong, or it's at least important to consider the other side when I guess dealing with issues happening today with current events, but also when you are reading an article, you're reading an argumentative article. Okay, um, so remember to do the reading assignment this week as well. It's just simply to read something that we've talked about so far from the textbook, and it doesn't have to be like one thing, it can be multiple things. I mean, for example, today we're going to talk about summarizing a little bit and how that can maybe strengthen you as a writer, or anything else that we've talked about, or anything else that kind of grabs your eye from the first couple chapters there. And then the second part of that is just read that article from Blanda, and you can maybe pick one of the questions from the back there to answer, or you can just anything about that article that you find interesting and how you think it might be relevant, especially with everything that's happening today with current events and so forth. So anyways, your textbook talks about this idea of summarizing, and it is kind of a balancing act, because you as a writer, when you are consulting sources and you're connecting them to your own arguments or your own paper, you want to summarize them, but you don't want to have your paper be too much of what they say. And vice versa, you don't want to have too much of what you say and not connect it to what they say. So this is, once again, the title of the book is They Say, I Say. But you want to summarize it in a way that your reader understands the source and what the main points are, and also connecting that source to your own argument. But a key thing I wanted to mention, though, about this is that when you summarize a source, you're not just saying what they say, but try to analyze and interpret their arguments and do more of an analysis of the source. Don't just list what they say. So it's kind of a balancing act. So enough summary what they say and then make connections to what you say. So like one example from the film world, if you've ever seen a movie named Seven, which is one of the best movies of the 1990s, and it's with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. And anyways, though, the writer of that movie is named Andrew Kevin Walker, and he's kind of an unknown in Hollywood because he does a lot of uncredited work. So I should say that he's unknown to the public, but he's very well known inside Hollywood. And so he does a lot of uncredited rewrites for a lot of David Fincher movies and so forth. But anyways, though, he wrote Seven. Now, interesting thing, kind of on a side note here, that maybe we'll get into a little bit later this semester, but when he wrote this movie, it was the very first draft, it was his very first movie. And what happened is that he wrote it one way. He had his first draft by mistake, and then the studio didn't like it and they made him write like 10 more drafts, whatever. And they, by mistake, sent it to Brad Pitt, the first draft. And he's like, oh, this is awesome, I want to do it. And then they said, oh, no, that was the first draft. This is the 10th draft. And it was so bad that Brad Pitt said, no, wait a minute. No, I'm doing the first draft. I'm not doing the 10th draft. So it was kind of a contract thing too that got disputed. But needless to say, though, the first draft is the one they did. But the point, though, to relate it back to this, is that Andrew Kevin Walker, he says that the movie, of course, is about the seven deadly sins. So there are lots of different sources that he consulted, you know, Dante and the seven deadly sins and a lot of different books and things like that. But what he says is that it was always a balancing act, because he needed to take the theme of the seven deadly sins and what other authors had wrote, but also connect it in a creative way, in this case, creatively, to making a movie, to writing a movie about it. And he's kind of said, like, I just knew enough background information to get a point of what they said, but I didn't need to get into dissertations and things like that. I just use it as kind of a background or a backdrop. But the point, though, is that he was taking what they said and then connecting it to what he was going to say creatively. So it's kind of an interesting, and again, I highly recommend checking that movie out if you haven't seen it. So that's kind of a film example, but of course, we're talking in this class about academic writing, and the same thing applies, though. You want to take what other authors say, and don't just talk about what they say when you're summarizing, but talk about what their arguments are. Give an analysis of that source. Now, for the first paper that you will be doing, once again, you can't see that yet, but I kind of explained it to you in last class. And when you're doing that first paper, you're not necessarily going to be summarizing outside sources. You certainly can if you want. In fact, you can use some of the articles in this book to relate to that first essay if you want. I mean, you can also use, it doesn't have to be academic sources, but you could also use your family members, for instance, or your friends. So for instance, if you want to go into a field like, just off the top of my head, psychology or something like that, and maybe your family members, your parents don't want you to go into that field, you could relate that to your paper. So you could still summarize what they say and then what you say. So in the first paper, you might not necessarily be using summarizing necessarily, but you certainly can if you want to. So some of this doesn't always apply to the first paper. It'll apply later on this semester when you do the second paper and also the final project. When you are finding sources from our library, I'll show you how to get into the library resources. It's a little bit tricky, or at least it was over the summer, I know, because in fact, I was trying to get a book from the library, and I went back and forth with somebody from the library because they kept saying that, because it was on their list, it was in our database, and I said, but it's saying it's not available, but it's not checked out. So how can it be not available if it's not checked out? And they said, oh, no, it's available. And then finally they said, oh wait, you're right. And then finally, it's kind of, I mean, everybody was kind of confused over the summer with everything that's happening currently with COVID and everything. But needless to say, though, our library is up and running now. So if you need a book, remember that I know that some of you are online. And of course, our library has lots of online resources that we'll go through later in the semester. But also, just keep in mind, too, that if you're on the Altamont campus or a different campus, they might have the book that you're trying to find at that library, but you might also have to go to like the Sanford library where a lot of the books are. So just keep that in mind. So when you're on the database, once again, we'll get to that later in the semester, but if you're interested right now in looking at things for research or just for your personal interest, make sure that when you go to the library, look carefully at the campus that it's at, because a lot of the books that you'll find are in the Sanford library, maybe not another campus. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so the other thing to emphasize here that your authors point out in this chapter is about putting yourselves in their shoes. What that means is that when you are reading a source, whether it is a novel or whether it is a critique of that novel, just keep in mind the historical period in which it is written or when the author is criticizing it, because obviously things are different 200 years ago than they were in 2020. So what that means is, for example, if you are reading Thomas Jefferson or reading a source about Thomas Jefferson, and you might say, well, I condemn a person like that because they had slaves. But keep in mind that that was kind of prevalent at that time, not to condone slavery, but just keep in mind that, Jefferson also wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? And or if George Washington, for instance, you could say that, well, he was a slave owner, which he eventually freed his slaves, but he was a slave owner at first. And that doesn't take away the fact that he was an esteemed general and president. So try to keep your own biases out of when you're analyzing a source, and just try to be objective. Same thing goes for race. If you are a white person and you're reading a book from an African American author or something about the civil rights movement, keep in mind that your perspective, you're not going to know that author's perspective. So try to put yourselves, though, in their shoes. The same thing with gender. If you're male and you're reading about the women's rights movement or women's suffrage or just a women author in general, keep in mind that their perspective might be different historically, or in this case, gender, than yours. And so, for example, too, I mentioned last time that I had a class with on Jane Austen, right? Now, Jane Austen, she only wrote 6 books in her lifetime, and this was like a couple hundred years ago. But some people criticize her as an author. I know this sounds weird because she's a woman author, but some people read her books as being misogynist in some ways, because in that society, in her time, women could not really advance in society unless they married somebody wealthy. And the irony here is when people criticize Jane Austen books for that, she was actually making a social commentary about that, but some people don't understand that. But the point is that historical periods are different 200 years ago than they are now in 2020. So just keep that in mind. Also, from a cultural perspective, keep in mind that different countries have different cultures. That's why, for instance, just right off the top of my head here, but some of you may have worked for Disney, or maybe work for Disney. I know somebody from that's your age that works for Disney. And if you work for Disney, when they train you, when somebody comes up to you, if you're working in the park, and they ask for directions, they instruct their employees to always point with 2 fingers, not 1 finger like we would do in the United States. Why? Because in some countries, pointing with 1 finger is like the equivalent of the middle finger. So we have different cultural differences. Same thing goes if you're reading an author from, let's say, let's say South Korea, for instance. Well, South Korea has a very different structure than we do in the United States, language-wise. They tend to be more respectful of authority than we do in the United States. Now, both sides have good things about them, but just keep in mind that authors might come from different perspectives, different countries. I know that, for instance, in Japan, of course, if you are reading a textbook in Japan or reading an author from Japan, their perspective of the atomic bombs that ended World War II might be different than the American textbooks, which talk about it differently. So the point is to always try to put yourselves in that author's shoes, no matter what your opinion is, etc. So ideally, when you're summarizing in your paper, readers should not be able to, at least at first, be able to tell whether you agree or disagree. You'll get to that later on in your paper, but at first, when you're just summarizing, just explain what that author that you're citing is talking about. Objectivity is key, it's crucial. So your textbook talks about this essay that we'll read later, I think this semester, that's on page 647. It's called Don't Blame the Eater. And here, this is just an example of how one writer could summarize that essay. This is from page 32. David Senzisko's article, Don't Blame the Eater, is nothing more than an angry rant in which he accuses the fast food companies of an evil conspiracy to make people fat. I disagree with these companies, or that these companies have to make money and so on and so forth. Well, that's more of a subjective analysis. It's not objective, because first of all, if you read that essay, Don't Blame the Eater, the author does not say that fast food companies, he says that fast food companies have an effect, but he's not angry. So think of tone. He doesn't have an angry tone. And he says that there is no conspiracy. So this writer that's summarizing this article or this essay is not really doing a good job. So don't bring your own opinions into the summary. You'll do that later on, but also keep a respectful tone, I should say. And also, your textbook talks about this idea of closet cliche syndrome. That's when an author will summarize and they'll mistake, or the writer, I should say, I know it's confusing to go back and forth between the writer of the essay and the writer of the source that you're citing, but the writer of the essay, like you writing, would sometimes summarize the author that you're citing and mistaking what they actually say and just using cliches to do that. So it's called the closet cliche syndrome. So on page 34, they give you an example. I'm not going to go read through it, but they give you an example of a better objective summary of a source where it's pretty detailed. The first paragraph is pretty detailed, and they have a more respectful, objective summary of what the author is saying. And then the second paragraph, they would start out with, in my view, however, it is the parents and not the fast food chains who are responsible for their children's obesity, while it is true that many of today's parents, and so on and so forth. So it's a more objective summary. Let me just get to a question here real quick. Looks like, oh, that's okay. That's okay. And by the way, if you coming in late, that's fine. This will be recorded. Once again, just a reminder though, in the last class, we got shut off for just a minute. We got disconnected for just a minute. So if that happens, no worries. The session will still be going on. It's just make sure to log back in. And it wasn't my Wi-Fi or anything, because our Wi-Fi was fine. It was a Zoom thing, but so we got disconnected briefly. But so if it disconnects, no worries. We'll come back. Okay, so, and let me do something real quickly here. Whoops, okay. So another thing that oh, okay. So the thing to remember too is that like the closet cliche syndrome would be when the writer is summarizing and then not tying it into what the author actually says. Give me 1 second here. Okay. All right, so another thing to talk about is this idea of avoiding listing. Now, let me kind of elaborate on this though, because you don't want to have a paragraph when you're summarizing a source saying like, this author says this, then they say this, then they say that, then they say this, then they say that, and then moving on to the next paragraph, or maybe giving your analysis. You can sort of do that in a sense. You want to avoid listing it all in like one paragraph, but if you are summarizing a source in detail, you could have first, this author says this, and then expanding on that, and then the next paragraph, then they say this, and then expanding on that, and so forth. But you want to avoid just listing all their points in a single paragraph. The other thing to point out here is that you want to make sure to use strong verbs. That means instead of saying, they say this, they say that. I know that's a title of your textbook. They say this, they say that. What they say is important, but you want to say that they emphasize this or they argue that, rather than just saying they say or they believe. So your textbook gives some examples of different strong verbs that you can use. I mean, the author argues, the author emphasizes, the author establishes, the author chastises, the author implores, the author challenges, etc. And when we say the author implores, usually that's a call to action. So the author or writer implores us to do whatever it might be. And then on page 40, 41, they give you lists of these. I won't go through all of them, but I mean, if you're trying to have verbs for making a claim, you would say the author argues or the author emphasizes, etc. Verbs for expressing agreement. The author agrees that, the author admires that, the author endorses this viewpoint. Verbs that express agreement. The author reaffirms that, something like that. Verbs for questioning or disagreeing. The author refutes is always a good one. The author refutes that idea. the author contends that, the author denies that, and then finally verbs for making recommendations. The author pleads, the author implores, things like that. I do want to just real quickly talk about, this is something we're not going to do in class here, but one of the exercises at the end of that chapter is, it's kind of interesting. They say that in this activity that you could take a viewpoint and summarize it. In other words, give a position paper about your position, but then write a paper on the opposite position. Now that's kind of an interesting, we're not going to do that in this class, but I know that in like some classes, if you ever have a debate class, that might be one of the assignments, is to take an idea that you believe strongly in and then write a paper on the opposite viewpoint. So it does go back to this idea that the article that you'll be reading, the Blanda article, is kind of about writing about the other side and how the other side's not so dumb. So kind of an interesting activity that we sometimes do in other classes. We're not going to do it in this class, but if you ever had a debate class, maybe in high school, you may not have had to write a paper on that, but you may have been grouped with a team and there's another team on different sides of an issue, and each of you has to argue the opposite side of what you believe. Kind of an intriguing activity. So they also introduce on page 47 some templates for introducing quotations. One of the things you want to avoid is just talking or saying this author says, and then the quote, or so-and-so says, he says, she says. You want to always introduce your quote, such as according to X, then the quotation. Or if you go through the list here on page 47, in her book, blank, X maintains that blank. So you always want to introduce your quotes. The other thing, and this is something I was talking about in the earlier class, that I'm not sure if they teach this in high school for whatever reason, but sometimes students will just simply have a quotation with absolutely no introduction to the quote. It'll just be like literally a quotation, like, and then maybe they'll cite it, but it's just like dropped in there. You want to always make sure to introduce your quotations. So according to, or X agrees when she writes, then the quotation. And can you overuse quotations? The answer is absolutely you can. So you want to make sure that your paper is not just like laced with quotations. You want to, in fact, I'll show you when we get closer to the first, or actually it'll be the second paper probably, but I'll show you a formula or a template that you can use when you're writing a paragraph. The key thing about that though, is that whenever you have a quotation, you don't just want to move on to the next paragraph. You always want to explain that quotation in your own words or your own meaning. Like, what does that quotation mean? So it's one thing to have a good quotation, but then don't just move on to it, to the next paragraph. You want to always explain the quotation. Now, let me just ask you, and you can just type in the chat box, what is the difference between a quotation and a paraphrase? Or just what is a paraphrase? Yeah, hold on one second here. Yeah, as Jose says, it's a brief summary. It's, yeah, a summary. Now, let me ask you this. Are paraphrases good? Can they be useful? Yeah, Carrie put it well. Paraphrasing is what the author says, but in different words. Exactly. And so paraphrasing is very useful, I think. And the reason is that it shows you, give me 1 second here. Paraphrasing is good because it indicates to the reader that you understand what the quote says or what the author is saying. So you're putting that quotation that you would have, but you're just putting it in your words, you're explaining it. So it is evidence Yeah, as Laura says, it's evidence that the author knows or the writer knows what they're talking about. So paraphrasing is very good. And I mean, I can't speak to other classes, but I always say that if you have a paper and let's say that the assignment requires you to include a certain amount of quotes, I always say paraphrasing is just as good as a quote. So it can be either. I would try to maybe mix them up a little bit. But yeah, I would say that paraphrasing is a good thing. So now we get into the I say part. Now, okay, so you don't necessarily have to use this exam. I mean, I'm going to show you something from an article from the New York Times. Now, this is an article, this is a movie review, actually, but it's not an academic paper. But what the authors say anyways, though, is that you always want to be clear in what you are arguing about because you don't want to confuse the reader. So you see the second bullet point here, why do this? Because you want to be clear. So your thesis wants to be clear and concise. Now, unfortunately, I'll just tell you in advance, if you don't know already, sometimes you're going to be reading articles. Actually, a lot of times you'll be reading articles from the library, journal articles, academic journal articles. And unfortunately, the writers are not always clear. And they should be in an ideal world, in a perfect world, but they're not. Part of that might be because academics tend to be very snobbish. Part of that might just be because, I don't know, maybe their brains are clustered all the time. I don't know, well, sometimes it's too because the issues that they're talking about are very complex. So it's hard to maybe get a clear thesis. I mean, ideally, they should have a thesis. But let me just show you an article from the New York Times. And the reason why I want to show this is for a few things. So this is an article. This is actually a movie review from the New York Times. This is from an author named A.O. Scott, who is one of the best movie critics there is these days. And this is his review of $1 Million Baby, if you've ever seen it. It's old, you guys probably haven't seen it, it's from 2004, but a couple things I just want to point out. First, you always want to have a title. I mean, that should go without saying, but you'd be surprised how many students will turn in papers without a title. So you always want to have a title. And then this is what I want to show you this article for a few reasons. And we'll do this throughout the semester. We'll take a look at articles from various sources, but he starts out, very clear thesis. Clint Eastwood's $1 Million Baby is the best movie released by a major Hollywood studio this year, and not because it is the grandest, most ambitious, or even the most original. On the contrary, it is a quiet, intimately scaled, three-person drama directed in a patient, easygoing style without any of the displays of elusive cleverness or formal gimmickry that so often masquerade as important filmmaking these days. So it's a very, very clear thesis. Now, of course, in this case, the thesis is basically in the very first sentence of the review. So in your case, most academic papers are going to have their thesis at the last, I mean, it should be the last sentence of the very first paragraph. And you will also notice, of course, this is not a set rule in stone, but I would just say in general, longer sentences are usually good. But I don't want to make a blanket statement about that, because sometimes when I say that, that sort of leads to people having run-on sentences, which you don't want to do. But in general, you want to avoid short, choppy sentences, which read more like fragments. So, and of course, don't be too intimidated by the language. I mean, A.O. Scott, he's a very erudite writer. I think he graduated from Yale, so he uses a lot of words that you might not quite get. But I want to show this article just in a couple of other ways too. So he starts out with this, he goes through the summary, but I want to show you this right here though. Okay, so he has the last sentence of this paragraph. So the $1 Million Baby, with its open-hearted mixture of sentiment and grit, might almost be mistaken for a picture from the studio's 1934 lineup that was somehow mislaid for 70 years. Okay, and then if you're reading this, you would pause, right? Which is not to say that Mr. Eastwood, who is of the Depression era vintage himself, and so on and so forth, but I just want to show you how this is a good transition. It's like, okay, you would pause here. So this movie could be mistaken for a picture from the studio's 1934 lineup that was somehow mislaid for 7 years, period. Which is not to say that mysteries, so it's a pretty good transition. I know that in high school sometimes they tell you that you shouldn't begin a sentence with which or because or and or things like that, but in higher education, the classes that you'll have, you can kind of break the rules a little bit. And remember, I'm not saying this as a blanket statement for all your other future classes, but just in this class, I mean, you can break some of the rules. I mean, it's fine if it's done well, though. That's the key thing. So I'm not saying that which is always acceptable or appropriate to start a sentence with, but it can be effective. And then, so you can see, oh, the other thing I just wanted to point out real quick is, remember I talked about tone, the importance of tone. Well, newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, they usually refer to people as Mr. or Ms. It's just kind of in a formal, sort of respectful tone. So that might be different than most newspapers, but it's just worth pointing out to always pay attention to the tone of a source that you're looking at. And then he goes through the plot a little bit more, summarizes, and along the way, we're not going to read this whole article here, but along the way, in addition to summarizing the plot, he's also being argumentative in what he's referring to and what he's arguing for the review. And then another example of a good transition is down here. So the combination of eagerness and discipline and Scrap's quiet expertise at manipulating his buddy's few remaining heartstrings wear down Frankie's resistance, and he and Maggie are soon embarked on a classic underdog's journey toward triumph. And then pause, period. And then the next sentence, or next paragraph is, or so we are led to believe. So it's another good transition. Again, you could say like, oh, well, this is a fragment. Well, if it's done right, then it can be effective. Okay. And then finally at the end here, just I guess from a literary standpoint, this is kind of an odd way to end the review. But if you've ever seen the movie, the Clint Eastwood character reads the poet, William Butler Yeats, throughout the movie. And so A.O. Scott kind of concludes his article, his review here, with citing a Yeats poem. So you can see here that this poem, which seems to need to capture the paradoxical spirit, at once generous and mournful, of this old master, Mr. Eastwood, and his new masterpiece. And then it's kind of, again, he ends it with the poem, kind of unusual, but still, we'll take a look at articles like that this semester. And I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, we didn't quite get to this in the last class, so maybe we'll get to it at the end today if we have time. But I want to show you a paper from last semester, and we'll do this throughout the semester. We'll look at, because I think that's one of the best ways to teach and for you guys to learn, see what other students and other writers have done, and we'll see how we can maybe edit this paper. But like I said, we didn't get to that in the last class, so maybe if we run out of time, or even if we don't run out of time, maybe we'll save that for next class. But anyways, just a few more things here before I want to show you a video too, if we get the time. But so you want to start out with a straightforward statement and then go into details with the rest of the paper, make sure it's clear. And then they give you templates for disagreeing. So on page 58, for example, they give you a whole list of ways that you can disagree with a source. So you want to summarize the source, but then if you disagree with that source, you can use some of the templates that are on page 58, such as X, author X, is mistaken because she overlooks recent fossil discoveries in the South, or something like that. That's a good way to disagree, just directly stating. Or X's claim that blank rests upon the questionable assumption that blank. So that gives you templates to disagree. And then agreeing, but with a difference on page 60, Now, this is interesting. Once again, just to real quickly use a movie example, although you could use novel examples as well, but you could say that, like the movie Scarface, I assume that, that a lot of people have seen the 1983 version with Al Pacino. Well, somebody might come along just from a formalist standpoint and say that, oh, this is a good movie. This is a really good movie. It's got good character development. It uses violence cleverly, and it's well directed and so forth. So just from a formalist standpoint, somebody could say, oh, this is a really good movie. Somebody else could come along and say, this is a really good movie, not because it's well made or it's well acted. I mean, arguably Al Pacino's performance is way over the top, but it's a good movie because it's a commentary on the drug wars that were happening in the early 1980s. And another, just to take this a little bit further, you could take the 1932, I believe, 1932 movie Scarface and compare that to the 1983 movie. I think by the way, I think the old version, the 1932 version is a lot better. But anyways, though, you could say that, oh, well, Scarface is good, but I like both for different reasons. So you could agree with somebody, but for different reasons. And the same thing might apply for you guys on the first paper, for instance. Some of you, and I'm just using this hypothetically, but some of you might be history majors. So you might write your first paper on why history is a great major to have, and maybe because you want to become a history teacher, so that will set you up to know a lot about various subjects in history, American history before the Civil War, American history after the Civil War, maybe the Revolutionary War, things like that. And then another student, same sort of topic, they could say, well, history is a great major, not necessarily because it'll help you teach, but because it'll help me get a writing job with National Geographic, or it'll help me get a job with a museum or some historical society. So you're agreeing that history is a good major, but with a different sort of take on it. Same thing hypothetically with psychology. One student in here could write a paper on psychology is a great major because it will help me become a psychiatrist. So I'll be able to delve into people's personal problems and help them that way. Another student, same topic, could say that psychology is a great major because it'll help me become a social worker. And maybe I can take that degree and I can go to different countries and help people in different countries and from a psychological perspective, and it'll just help me get a job as a social worker. So you're taking the same topic, and you're agreeing that psychology is a great major, but maybe for a different reason. Okay, another way is to agree and disagree simultaneously. So your textbook gives an example of a writer who is addressing the topic of whether getting a liberal arts degree is good for students. Will it help them get a job? And the argument is no, liberal arts degrees are not good for helping students get a job. Okay, now the author or the writer that's commenting on this agrees with that premise, but he also disagrees because he says that right now, especially in this economy today in 2020, right now it might be difficult for any student with any degree to get a job right out of college because, whether it's the economy or whether it's just the nature of the difficulty in getting hired right away. So it's okay to disagree and disagree. Now, this idea of, is it okay to be undecided? Well, the authors say it can be if it's done properly, okay? Like, for example, to use current events with the COVID-19, you might be aware that there are 3 major vaccines right now. Actually, there are about 8 that are going into trial, but there are 3 that are kind of in the advanced steps or advanced stages of trial. And so there are 3 of them. So let's just say that hypothetically you were writing a paper on which is the best vaccine. And you conclude that right now it's just too difficult to say. I'm undecided. Nobody can tell which is going to be the best vaccine. So that would be an example of how you could maybe write a paper, and I guess you could come up with the conclusion that you're undecided. But in general, for this class, I would recommend avoiding this second bullet point here, being undecided. Ideally, you want to have a clear thesis, and you want to have a decision on that thesis, right? You want to be clear so that things are not undecided. So, but just to comment on the textbook though, your authors say that it can be okay if it's done well. Now let's take a look here at the brainstorming process, or I'm sorry, the writing process. This is from the Little Seagull book here. And it goes through all these various ways that you can start or begin the writing process. Now, everybody is going to have their own writing process, the way that they start out with. I mean, I think I told you last time, when I'm doing a research paper, what I'll do is I'll go through different sources and I'll pull out quotes from those sources and sort of build the essay around that. But everybody's going to have their own sort of method or strategy when it comes to the writing process. I mean, obviously everybody's going to start out with brainstorming. So you're going to have an idea, you're going to be thinking about it, maybe not even necessarily writing anything down, but you're going to have an idea. Free writing would just be simply where you are maybe spending 5 or 10 minutes and just writing down every single thing that you can think about that topic. You know, looping is interesting. That's where you would okay, as a textbook says, you would write for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, jotting down whatever you know about the subject, and then at the end, maybe developing a thesis statement around that. Clustering might be where you put your main idea in the center of a page, and then you have different points around that term. And then questioning, I think, is I think a really good approach. This is the journalism approach. This is where you would ask the who, what, where, when, why. So as an example of this, let's just say that you were taking the topic, why is traffic so bad in Orlando? Which I know that some of you are online, so you might not be here in Orlando. I know a lot of you, though, are here in the Orlando area, so you're definitely aware that traffic is really bad in Orlando. And let's just take that topic for a minute. And I think where you could do the journalism approach, where who, what, where, when, why. Okay, who is affected? Well, the people in Orlando, maybe also tourists, you could say. What, the issue is traffic. The why, which we'll get to in a second here, but the when, you could talk about it from a different era, if you will, or let's, for the sake of simplicity, let's just stick with 2020. That would be the when. And then how is traffic so bad? Well, that's connected to the why. So there are various reasons that you could come up with. Why is traffic so bad in Orlando? You could talk about maybe overpopulation. You could also think of tourism and how that leads to overpopulation, perhaps. You could talk about the hotels. You could talk about the theme parks, which leads to more tourism, which leads to overpopulation, perhaps. You could talk about construction. You could talk about poor districts, or I should say maybe city management when they were coming up with the roads. Now, kind of an interesting side note here. I know somebody who knows somebody, so I guess I got a friend of a friend who's very familiar with like city development and planning. And he said that when they were coming up with the roads in Orlando, they didn't really anticipate all the population, all the theme parks that would happen here and so forth. And so they really kind of did a bad job. And that's why you'll notice that if you ever go down I-4, it's never straight. It's constantly curving back and forth. There's construction everywhere. So maybe that could be a reason why traffic is so bad in Orlando. So anyways, you have all of these different ideas out there, all of them which could apply to your paper. You could talk about all of these things. And so your thesis might be something like, there are many reasons for why traffic is bad and congested in Orlando, such as blank, blank, blank. But the most, the biggest contributing factor might be, remember, you want to qualify your thesis. So the biggest contributing factor might be theme parks. because it leads to overpopulation and so forth. So, and then somebody else could come along, same topic, they could agree with disagreeing. They could say that, oh, well, traffic is bad in Orlando for blank, 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 blank reasons, but the most significant reason why traffic is congested is arguably, once again, that's qualifying the thesis, arguably the construction that is constantly taking place, something like that. So that's just an example of maybe how you could develop a thesis around that. Okay, and the other thing to mention here is that, yes, your thesis is likely going to change over time. So expect surprises. I mean, this has happened personally, but also with other students I know that they'll start out going one way in an argument, and then they'll change it like 180 degrees to what it was. So remember that your thesis and your paper in general is likely going to change over time as you go through the process of developing the final draft, okay? Also, okay, the writing process, try not to wait until the last minute, okay? Because I can tell you, this class, I guess partially, but also, you know, other places I've taught like UCF, where most of the assignments are due Sunday night at midnight or 11:59, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, well, some students will take an assignment and they'll wait until the last minute to do it. They'll say, oh, I'll do it over the weekend. And what happens? Well, a lot of times they procrastinate and just things happen a lot of times. For example, sometimes family things come up. Sometimes it is weather issues that come up. I mean, if you remember, if you were here a couple of years ago, this was Hurricane Irma, I think, or is it Maria or Irma? I think it was Irma that was here. I think Maria was in Puerto Rico. But anyways, when Irma came, guess what? I know that in Kissimmee, a lot of students lost power. They didn't have internet. So things like that happen, and a lot of times they're out of your control. So you always want to wait. You don't want to wait until the last minute. The other thing too is that once you complete a draft, a lot of times it helps to maybe put that draft away for a day or two and then come back to it, and you'll be amazed. You'll be astonished at how many mistakes that you catch, okay? Also expect to have many edits or drafts as you go along. Of course, I said, don't worry so much about spelling and grammar at first. That will be something that you can work on and complete when you complete your final draft. You'll fix all the grammar and spelling mistakes, but don't get tied up with that at first, because if you write a paragraph and then you go, just waste your time going through all the spelling and grammar or word choice and things like that at first, it's gonna waste time. So worry about spelling and grammar at the end. Proofreading comes later. Also, how many of you have Grammarly, out of curiosity? Probably. Okay, yeah, a lot of people. Cheyenne says yes. Yeah, so a lot of you. Now, the thing is with Grammarly, it is free, but so it'll definitely help you. But I know that there are paid versions. I'm not sure how much it costs for the paid versions, but from what I understand, it'll give you a little bit more, of course, than the free version will, but still, Grammarly is a tool that is free, so that'll help you. The other thing, I don't think we're gonna have, well, we might have time. I wanna show you a draft from a student from last semester, and I wanna show you a couple other things too, but maybe depending on time, we'll see, play things by ear, actually. Okay, so when we talked about the New York Times article, the importance of transitions with that movie review of Million Dollar Baby. Also, some common errors, of course, it's, there, affect, affect. Just one thing to note about the first bullet point is that it's with an apostrophe, always, without exception, stands for it is or it has, okay? Now, the other thing to note is that the papers that you'll be doing for your classes, like MLA or if it's APA, either one, will not be using contractions. Now, it doesn't mean apostrophes. Like if you were to say like Bryce's phone or something like that, of course you would have an apostrophe, you would have Bryce apostrophe S. But in terms of contractions with like it's, you would always write out it is or it has, okay? So you're going to always use it is or it has. Same thing with the second bullet point with there with an apostrophe. You would always write out they are instead of there with an apostrophe RE. So there. And then finally, the third bullet point, okay, this is confusing because both effect with an E and affect with an A, I mean, they're both pronounced the same essentially, but both can be used as either a noun or a verb depending on how it's used. But the easiest way to remember this is that most of the time, the vast majority of the time, affect with an E is going to always be a noun, and affect with an A is always going to be a verb. Okay, so real quickly, I know this might be review for, you know, kind of like high school review for this, for a lot of you, but let's just real quickly take a look here. And we don't have to write this in the chat box. I'll just kind of go through them real quick. So this is looking at it's, okay, so number one, it's with an apostrophe. It is about time you showed up. It was it's without an apostrophe, number two. Okay, number three, it's without an apostrophe. Number four, it's with an apostrophe because you're saying it is time for school. Number five, would say it's been a long time with an apostrophe because you're saying it has been a long time. So with an apostrophe for that one. Number six, it's important with an apostrophe. It is important. Number seven, it's without an apostrophe. You know, it's Cubs. Number eight, it's with an apostrophe. It is my turn to go. Number nine, the dog felt great with it's without an apostrophe. It's new tail, new haircut. Number 10, it's with an apostrophe. Number 11, it's without an apostrophe. Number 12, it's without an apostrophe. Number 13, it's without an apostrophe. And then finally, number 14, it is. So it's with an apostrophe there. And then real quickly, again, I know this is review for most of you, but with affect and effect, just real quickly, number one would be effect with, it's a noun, a positive effect on my mood. Number two, affect with an A. Number three, affect with an A. Number four, the effect with an E of the changes was staggering. Number five, affect with an A. Number six, effect with an E. Number seven, affect with an A. How does this program affect participants? Number eight, the movie had a bad effect with an E on my brother. And number nine, we are trying to affect with an A. And then number 10, a negative effect has been seen in the trials with an E there. So once again, I know that's review. Now, just trying to look at how much time we have here. So we still have, we have time, okay. So the Little Seagull talks about on page, on page 17 of the Little Seagull, it introduces you to this author named Sherman Alexie, and he talks about developing paragraphs. And he says, quote, I can remember picking up my father's books before I could read. The words themselves were mostly foreign, but I still remember the exact moment when I first understood with a sudden clarity the purpose of a paragraph. I didn't have the vocabulary to say paragraph, but I realized the paragraph was a fence that held words. The words inside a paragraph worked together for a common purpose. They had some specific reason for being inside the same fence. So what he's trying to say here is that think of a paragraph as a fence where you have one main idea, one topic sentence, and then the sentences below that, beneath that, relate to that topic sentence. So the metaphor would be like you drive through a subdivision and you go drive past house after house, and each house is fenced in. That's kind of a good metaphor for writing and how you want to have one main idea per paragraph. I mean, I can tell you there are sometimes students will write paragraphs that are way too long. They need to break it up, or vice versa. Sometimes students write paragraphs that are way too short and they need to expand on them. So the key is to have one idea, one main topic sentence per paragraph, and then you'll move on. Once again, I'll show you a sort of a formula that you can follow, or sort of a template that you can follow. So I guess we have about, okay, so I'm gonna show you a video. We'll save some other things for next time. I'm gonna show you the video. We're probably, I think this class ends at 10:45, right? So we're not gonna get through the whole video here, but I just wanna introduce you to this author, Sherman Alexie, who I just quoted there. And he just talks a little bit about his writing, the writing process, and talks about himself as an author and his Native American background and how that influences his writing. So we'll just watch a few minutes of this, and then I'll wrap up a little bit early and then answer any questions, and then any last minute things, okay?
My name is Sherman Alexie, and I'm the bantamweight champion of the world. No, I'm a writer, poet, short story writer, novelist, screenwriter. You young bastard, I'm doing okay. It is a strange dilemma because in some sense, you know, I was very native identified, and I still am, but that's almost become secondary. I've sort of joined the tribe of highly established literary writers. So, you know, I'm with the Jonathan Franzens of the world. You know, I know them a little bit, but that's sort of my peer group now, rather than this sort of, you know, Indian world, literary world. I'm now in you know, this sort of make-believe world of writers who supposedly hang out a lot, although none of us ever do. So I'm in a faux community of writers, highly successful literary writers now. Oh, it's all, I mean, I haven't changed anything I've written based on all that stuff. So the perceptions of me may have changed, or my career, but I'm still writing the same stuff. It's still pretty much about Spokane Indian males, you know, stumbling through life. So I think it's because of the combination of skills I have. You know, I work in multi-genres. You know, I do stand-up comedy. I help make movies. I think all of that has contributed to it. I'm not just a novelist or not just a short story writer. So I think in this highly technological world with many diverse and diffuse influences, I think I'm able to hit a lot of bases. Nobody who's ever been poor would ever use the phrase selling out. You know, my influences in the multi-genre artists come from my Indian writing ancestors, the previous generation. When you're talking James Welch, Simon Ortiz, Scott Momaday, Joy Harjo, Leslie Silko, Linda Hogan, Adrian C. Lewis, all of these writers were multi-genre. They all wrote poetry and novels and short stories and nonfiction and dabbled in songwriting and filmmaking and documentary making. So my original influences were Native American multi-genre artists. Now, these days, the younger Native writers are not multi-genre, so it's very interesting. I'm not sure what's happening, why that has changed, but I grew up as a kid writer. Nobody ever told me I was supposed to be one thing. So just because I've happened to become successful in a number of those genres, it wasn't because I was pursuing them economically. It was because I saw the artistic possibilities in all of it. And I was taught those when I was a 19-year-old undergraduate. Yeah, I think I'm the least educated Indian writer out there. I've taught at the University of Washington, but I'm not a good teacher, so I think that probably disqualifies me. Yeah, I'm not an academia at all. in terms of a full-time career. I think it's interesting because I think when you look at Native American literature, you're going to find that it doesn't really reflect the diversity of the ways in which the writers actually live their lives. Nobody has ever written, for instance, an academic farce, a Native American teacher at college farce, which is a time-honored and wonderful genre. You know, David Lodge made a whole career out of it, writing academic farces, and every writer you can name has written it, but we haven't done it. Where's that novel about that Indian architect or that Indian lawyer? There's a distinct lack of white-collar Native American literature, despite the fact that most of its most visible practitioners are white-collar themselves. So I think there's an effort, somewhat of an insecurity to prove your Indianness by focusing almost entirely on a reservation-based identity. I think it's old-fashioned, actually. You know, I think people think it's something new, but the idea of being a storyteller, you know, for most of our existence was not related to books. It was about the ability to stand up in front of the fire and, you know, earn your supper. So I think it's just something old and inspired in me. But I never really was the funny guy growing up. If you'd ask my siblings, they'd tell you I was the depressed guy in the basement. But they're the funny ones. But I got on stage and started talking and people laughed. At the beginning, I didn't even necessarily know what was happening. But as the years have gone on, I realized that humor is pretty amazing in its ability to transcend differences politically, ethnically, racially, geographically, economically. There's something about it that really opens people up spiritually, I think, and they listen, they pay attention. And it's also a great way to offend people. I don't know, we've all been to literary readings, you know, where we got theater, but so bored by the person up in front of us, reading their work so dispassionately that it nearly turns us off their books. There are writers who I've heard do their work that I could only hear their voice when I'm reading their books, and it's so disinterested in their own stuff, and I just never wanted to do that. I wanted to make the mistake the other way. You know, I'm pleased when somebody's offended, you know, by my large stage presence. Because there's still people who show up who get offended. I get up there and give a show and I'm improvising and, you know, talking about current events and what happened yesterday or what happened an hour ago, what happened 5 minutes before I walked into the place, you know, and giving people a glimpse of how my, you know, crazy mind works. And then they'll come up after me and say, well, I'm really disappointed you didn't read the story. And you look at them and think, well, you can read the story. You know, what happened tonight will only happen once. You know, you were here for one-time thing. So I guess people are trapped in their perceptions of what a literary artist is supposed to be. You know, I write poems naturally. I'm writing them all the time. I think it's more of a reflex talent than fiction is for me. It seems like I have to work harder to write fiction. That said, poems are much more demanding. You have fewer words. You can make fewer mistakes. You know, if you write a 10-line poem, you really can't make any mistakes. If you do, the poem is terrible. You know, when you write a novel, you have all that space to mess up in. People are more forgiving. So I think poetry audiences are far more demanding than fiction audiences are. Well, you know, writers generally come in two groups. Those who love what they do and those who can't stand what they do. I'm in the second group. I have a really difficult time looking back. So I figure out of the thousands of pages I published, there's probably about 100 great pages. I think I work on probably about a 2% greatness rate. So there's probably 10 poems, 2 stories that are great. And the rest of it is from anywhere from pretty good to, you know, total crap. You know, the book is not played out. The idea of what a book can be is not played out in its form as it is, with paper and covers. And there are things it can be that digital will never touch. And that's one of the things I wanted to do with this. And comparing it to a cassette tape, the old-fashioned way of making a mixtape, which, you know, I love burning CDs too. but there is something far more passionate and hands-on and hard work about making a mixtape on a cassette. It's too easy to revise with a CD. And today's technology makes it too easy to change immediately. You can cover your mistakes quicker. I think it allows you to have this sheen of perfection around yourself. And with an old-fashioned book or an old-fashioned cassette tape, you can actually see all the flaws and imperfections and the bad choices. And I think there's something we lose with technology when you talk about bad choices. They cost $300, number one. I don't think anything that costs $300 can be called egalitarian.
I just want to pause this for 1 second here. I think this is a couple years old because nowadays ebooks are not that expensive. And I think everybody now has access to a Kindle, right? Whenever you buy a book on Amazon. So I just wanted to point that out.
And how much of the world can afford a $300 reading device? 1% of 1% of 1%. It automatically qualifies for, economically elite status. But what's really going on here, the reading public doesn't really know about. All they're concerned about and all they're defending is their reading convenience, which I completely understand, whether it's because of physical disabilities or because of personal preference or just the newness of it, why they love a digital book. But they don't understand the economic corporate pressures going on in the publishing world. And what's going to happen, and this is going to happen on the internet too. We like to pretend that the internet is free. We like to pretend it's an open source culture. But as culture changes, as old corporate models of distributing information are changing, I don't know why people assume that corporations aren't going to take over this medium as well, because they can. So what's happening in the book world, digital books, is that these ebook companies, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, others that are rising, they just don't seek to publish books. They're going to end up seeking the books to be chosen to be published. So this economic model, the way it's set up now, is going to favor a certain kind of book. And publishers, and being economically motivated companies, are only going to be publishing those kind of books. And the divide between pop culture, pop writing, and literary writing is just going to increase and increase and increase. And it's going to make it harder and harder and harder for first-time writers to get published in any form whatsoever where they'll get attention. Who can find you? Who's going to find anybody? Nobody's really risen out of the internet to become a major voice. They always end up getting a book published, and then the book makes them a major voice. But nobody has. I mean, I'm trying to think. I'm not internet averse at all. I'm doing this. I love the internet. But the fact is that it's a giant, giant unfiltered library, which has its strengths and beauty, but it's impossible to find people. And what we end up doing anyway is I go to about 5 sites. And I think most people probably do the same thing. You create this little small town inside the internet, and we end up in all these little tiny separate communities. Joan Jett, in an interview with Joan Jett, she said about the music industry, she said the thing that's missing now is anticipation. She said that nobody gets in a big line outside of Tower Records anymore waiting for that new Stones album to drop. And nobody stands in line outside a record store waiting to buy the tickets for the Who concert. There's a real lack of community on the, in the internet experience when it comes to art. And you can't tell me, and it's not true, that communicating strictly through the internet forms community in the way that being together does. You're missing all but one sense. You don't smell people, you don't really hear them, you don't see them. And we're animals, we're creatures of senses, and the internet deprives you of many of those. So I know there's new art coming based on this technology, and some of it's happening, and it's exciting and interesting, but there's nothing wrong with the old art. And I always worry, and you see it with certain internet folks, the way in which they're completely willing to jettison their past in the pursuit of something new. And that's what I'm worried about. Well, in order to write about the emotional state of a character, I have to get as close as possible to being in that emotional state. So I have to get that sad. I have to get that happy, that crazed, that bizarre, that obsessed. You know, what my characters are going through, I have to find my way into it. You know, it's just the way I do it. There's a story in this book called The Ballad of Paul Nonetheless, where he becomes so obsessed with pop music and so obsessed with his iPod that he you know, every thought he has becomes directly related to a song. So I went that far into it. I tried to talk only in song lyrics. You know, whenever anybody was talking to me, I drove my friends and family mad because whenever they would talk to me, you know, I would say, well, that reminds me of this, you know, Rolling Stone song. Or whenever anybody said something accidentally that was a lyric or a title of a song, I would then sing the song. So it was crazy. But it got me, seeing the way it was completely alienating my friends and family really got me to a place where I could write that story about this really genial guy who's actually very much an anti-hero.
Okay, so we'll pick up on this next time. Just one comment I wanted to make real quick. When he's talking about how the internet, we think of it as being free, I think kind of an extension of that actually is take YouTube, for example. Now, I'm older than I think most of you, but I remember back in the day when YouTube used to never have any commercials at all. And the big question in media used to be, well, how is YouTube going to make money? And of course, it's not just YouTube, but now everything you have, everything you watch, everything you come across has a million ads on it. So I think that's kind of what he's talking about. So anyways, we'll pick up on this Wednesday. Remember, we're not going to have class on Monday because of the holiday. So we'll pick up on this on Wednesday, and we'll talk a little bit about next week's assignments and everything. Next time, remember to do the reading assignment for this week. And before we wrap up here and I close out the recording, are there any questions?
Hey, Professor.
Yeah.
I have a question. For the reading assignment, when they're saying like chapters, are you talking about like on page 19, like when it says number 1, like they say, like on page 19? Is that what you're talking about? Read that.
Yeah, just the first few chapters. Just pick out like a passage or one of the points that the authors make, and whether they, you know, whether what they say in that passage might affect you as a writer or might help you as a writer.
Oh, okay.
I have one, Professor.
Oh, okay.
This is, I know there was a problem with Zoom last week, and there was also a problem, I think, on Monday, if I'm not mistaken, because I couldn't get in. So this is like my first class with you in the course. So I wanted to know where do we find the readings and all that stuff? Is it on Canvas? Is that on a specific website?
If you go to the syllabus, there's a calendar there.
Okay.
Yeah, at the very bottom, there's like a calendar of the semester, basically. So for this week, it's just a few chapters of the first few chapters of They Say, I Say, and then just on the little seagull up to page, I think 24 or something like that.
Okay. And I had one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Am I the only one that had that problem that they just couldn't get into the Zoom? Because last week I just couldn't get in. I don't know why. It just would not let me in.
Yeah, last week there was a problem, but 2 days ago, Monday, there was no problem. Did anybody else have a problem or?
No, I got it fine on Monday.
I had a problem getting in today.
Yeah, so did I.
Like someone had to send me the code or whatever, because the one that you sent out said it was started at 8 a.m.
You had to scroll down.
Yeah,
I tried using that one too, and it said waiting, and I couldn't get in.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I don't know why, because I mean, people were able to get in. We do have right now 23 participants. We had 15 in the 8 a.m. session, so I'm not exactly sure why it wouldn't work. Okay,
so just for the next time that we meet, will there be a different password that you send out, or are we using this same one?
No, there'll be a new one each time. So like there'll be
Okay.
an announcement for each one, and you can come to the 8 o'clock or the 9:30 one. Like I said, the
Okay.
same exact class. So it doesn't matter which one you come to. But yeah, I don't know why that code wouldn't be working, but I'm not sure exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
I think are you using this off a MacBook?
Yeah.
I think MacBook, I don't know why they've been having problem with Zoom sessions. I think that's what I've heard from some professors, that MacBook has just been having a few issues here and there.
That's interesting. You know what? I'll actually ask the department head about that. But yeah, thanks for letting me know though, because I'll look into that actually.
All right.
So, but in any case though, if you ever have to miss a Zoom session or if you can't get in or whatever, remember that these are all going to be recorded, and I'll put a link to the YouTube so you can always check it out afterwards.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
And last question, you said for the Little Seagull just to up to page 24, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. And then Carrie says use the link, not the code. I'm not sure. I guess maybe that'll help. I'm not. Actually, I think I know what you're talking about, Carrie. You're talking about just to copy and paste the link that's in there, right?
Into the URL.
Yeah, I think so.
So, question, Professor. I'm looking at our assignment right now that's going to be due this Sunday. It says read the first 7 chapters of They Say, I Say. And then for the part 2, is that going to be in the Little Seagull book?
No. Part 2 is actually an article from They Say, I Say. I think it's on page 212. It's called The Other Side. The Other Side is Not Dumb. Yeah. And it's just a short little essay, and then you can approach it. I mean, just all I'm looking for is just a short response. Like, is there anything from that essay that you would want to comment on, or you can even answer like one of the questions at the end of that essay.
All right. Choose a person. All right. That sounds good. All right. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, everybody, thanks for attending. Remember, we'll meet again next Wednesday, like a week from today. And everybody have a good holiday break, and we'll see you later. And this recorded session will be on YouTube later this afternoon.
Thank you.